Wel, bore da pawb a croeso cynnes iawn i'r olaf o 3 sgwrs yn trafod yr economi sylfaenol. Good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome to the third and final event discussing the foundational economy. My name is Ian Rhys-Jones, and I'm director of the Wizard Civil Society Centre. And as you know, we've been awarded an ESRC Centre grant to continue a programme of work looking at civic stratification and civil repair. And an important part of that work is a theme that specifically addresses aspects of the foundational economy in Wales and internationally. And part of that work will involve events and colloquia on an annual basis. And we were, of course, planning a major one in Cardiff this year, but unfortunately events have overtaken us, and this series of online events is an attempt to replace that. Our aim always was to involve academics, practitioners, politicians and policy actors in the events, both presenting and discussing. And I hope we've achieved that over the last 3 days. I think we've had an exciting collection of speakers and really interesting discussions. Our chair today is Debbie Green from Coastal Housing Group. And before I hand over to Debbie, a couple of things I'd like to say. First of all, I'd like to thank all our speakers over the last 3 days and everyone for participating. And the reason I'm doing that now is because the nature of Zoom means that when we end today, it'll close down very abruptly. So I'd like to get that those thank yous out first of all, and in particular to Chloe MacDonald for organising the 3 days for us. For those of you who haven't been in the other days, we record these events. The audience won't be recorded, but in case you missed it or popped out, you will be able to see all 3 seminar events on the Wizard website and on the Foundational Economy website. We want these to be open discussions as much as presentations. So there will be a question and answer session today, and the way you participate in that is you click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you want to ask your question personally, preface your question with the word talk. If you don't want to personally ask the question, just write out the question and Debbie will ask the question on your behalf. We will have a break in the middle, just a short break before going into Q&A. So I think you've heard enough from me. Thanks everybody for participating, and over now to Debbie to introduce today's speakers.
Hello everyone and welcome. I'm really pleased to be able to chair this event. Excuse me if it's a bit clunky on my behalf. Had a slightly rocky introduction into the technology this morning. We've got some really great speakers this morning to talk to, so I'm really pleased to welcome Sophie Howe, Lee Waters and Elin Howe to speak to us for, I think they've got about 20 minutes each to talk to us. And then as Ian said, there's opportunities for you to be submitting questions in the chat box, so please do that. I anticipate both some really lively presentations and some really great discussion afterwards. I don't want to take up too much of your time, so with that introduction, if the first speaker can kick off, please.
Morning then. Hi, thanks Debbie. I'm Lee Waters and I'm the Deputy Minister for Economy and Transport in the Welsh Government. And the good news is I don't intend to speak for 20 minutes, nor do I intend to use the speech that has been prepared for me, which is a perfectly good speech and I'd be happy to circulate. But I just really want to take part in a discussion. So I'll just set out some initial thoughts and then shut my cake hole and we can have a conversation hopefully. what I'm finding really interesting about what we're trying to do in the Welsh Government is, if there's the famous Mario Cuomo quote of, you campaign in poetry, you govern in prose. And I think the poetry side of the foundational economy is now fairly familiar to us. It's a compelling narrative arc and touches on all the right notes. The prose bit is bloody difficult. And that's really what I'm wrestling with, is how do we turn these ideas into practice in the Welsh context, which is a complex landscape. And that's what we're working through in detail. Now, COVID really has thrown a lot of these issues into sharp relief. And the Welsh Government are working on a recovery programme of what we're going to be doing for the rest of this term. And the foundational economy is front and centre of that plan. We met as a cabinet yesterday to discuss it and agree it. And I think there's widespread recognition, and COVID has been helpful in that sense, in showing, as Kevin Morgan and Carol Williams have described before, the foundational economy is well-being critical. It really is a part of the everyday that we rely upon to use Kevin's phrase, keep us safe, sound and civilized. And the strain that COVID has put on society has really thrown that up. And the concept of key workers, I think, has now given us a clear definition that everybody can understand of who it is that is captured by the foundational economy and their value, which has been often overlooked by all of us, not just governments, but by society. So that, in a sense, has given us a more helpful framing. But on the other hand, it's given us a very challenging delivery landscape, because there's a lot going on, and being able to focus on culture change and delivery change within that crowded landscape is difficult. One area, I think, again, which has been very useful to illustrate the relevance of the foundational economy and the flaws of the conventional approach, has been in the supply and procurement of personal protective equipment. So that's one of the things I've been leading on within government over the last couple of months, and we've got a good story to tell on it. But what's very interesting to me about it is both the pitfalls of the fragmented supply chain that we had before. So, most of the world's PPE has been produced in China because it is cheap, and obviously in a global pandemic, when there are multiple lockdowns, that collapses. And so what it has allowed us to realize in all parts of the system is a need for resilience and a need for local supply, which you can rely upon. And the economic opportunities from relocalizing that supply. And that is, the penny has been dropping all across the Welsh public sector of the value of that. And we are now working hard in trying to get Welsh firms into that supply chain, and there are many success stories of where that has happened. But there's always the tension in procurement, and this is at the sharp end of realizing the lessons of this. There is still that impulse to put the big contracts in to get us that security of supply into sort of the next year. And so, well, on the one hand, there is a recognition and realization that we need to source more locally for the reasons I've set out. There's still that desire to have that security of supply, which is still involving us wanting to put big contracts down with non-domestic suppliers. So there's that tension all the time between recognizing the value of the foundational economy on the one hand and the pull of the safe and the conventional and what we know, and that is something we are working through. So we've decided to focus on food procurement and PPE procurement as a way of illustrating what the foundational economy is to people, and also in terms of getting some deliverable quickish wins. I won't overstate the quick, but quickish. And so the experimental fund that we have 52 projects, we had 52 projects, a number of them have failed because of COVID, and we are reprioritizing that and bringing some new ones in as a result. They offer us examples of trials. It's, I think, to be brutally honest, and not always a wise course of action, as I've discovered, but I'll persist with it nonetheless. You know, the ability of the government machine to be able to understand and manage trials and experiments at this scale is really difficult. We are used to a grant management regime where we get quarterly reports and we hit the metrics, and at the end of it we get a report and the system is happy. And this is a more dynamic model that we're trying to develop, where we co-produce and have communities of practice to try and learn iteratively from each other, and that is really difficult to do. So that in itself is one of the experiments, the approach. We have now a community of practice getting underway that Canal Cymru is leading for us, and we are creating some of our own communities of practices. So Liz Lucas from Caerphilly County Council, along with Kevin Morgan and others, have been doing a procurement review panel for us of those projects within the trial fund that are focusing on procurement, and they've submitted a pretty sobering report which shows many shortcomings in the trials. And what's depressing about it is it's a very familiar story to what we've been reading about for years. And so it shows that in the nitty-gritty delivery bit, we are still a long way off from where we need to be, and that is about the things we know about. You know, it's about capacity, it's about skill, it's about status in the organisation, all the things that you know, the academic researchers have been telling us for some time, and the work that Sophie Howe has been doing through her procurement review is showing us too. So as a reality check, really, you know, we know where the problems are. It's changing them remains a challenge for us. And as I say, in a system which is busy with other priorities, that is already stretched and strained, that is a real challenge that we are grappling with now. So I think we can make some progress through PPE and food. We've had a good bit of progress with the NHS. So the NHS in Wales have agreed to develop a delivery plan quickly over the next couple of weeks, recognising its role as an anchor institution within the Welsh economy. So that's going to focus on deliverables, and we'll be developing a delivery plan for the other elements as well. You know, we're fine. I think, you know, we're not fine, but we've got enough to begin on with on the strategic outlook. I think we know what needs to change. It's, you know, in digital they often say that the strategy is the doing. Just get stuff done, and I think that's where I've reached with the foundational economy agenda. It's you know, there's no point faffing over a perfect template. Let's just make some change programs which can then demonstrate the value of this. And I say it's those pennies dropping that we want to see, and I think there's huge potential to do that both in PP and in food. There's much more I can talk about, but why don't I be quiet for now, and then happy to tease out the other themes that the other contributors mention in the comments and discussion afterwards. Diolch.
Thank you very much, Lee, for that. So, I mean, I think it's a really recurrent theme in terms of how do we turn ideas into practice, and really excited by the conclusion of, well, let's just do it. And I think that's a bit of a seamless introduction then to Elin Hywel from Cwmni Bro, who is going to talk to us about her experience in terms of wellbeing and economic renewal in practice. So thank you very much, Elin.
Thank you. I'm going to start actually with showing you a short video. We've only just finished this video, so you're the first to see it. And it's really our attempt to communicate what the foundational economy is and why it's important to the rest of the world. So I'll start with that. So I'm going to share my screen, so bear with me.
Dolan. success of each community is based on our ability to prosper. Can we work and live in the same community? Can we attend school down the road? Go to the doctor, to the shop, and to the bank without leaving our home turf? The economy is a big part of the lives of all of us, and therefore an integral part of a community. The Dollan project focuses on the development of the economy that is the foundation to our lives in our communities, the foundational economy. To make it work for us, with the benefits flowing back into the local economy, to strengthen our communities for tomorrow. Without it, our ability to live in our community deteriorates. It could be a service such as electricity or another aspect of infrastructure. It could be a food supplier, a hairdresser, a leisure centre. It could be a major local employer, a sector integral to our community such as tourism, quarries, an important factory, a university or a hospital. The foundational economy includes anything that's fundamental to the ability of the community to function and thus enable us to live in our community. So, what's the problem? Elements of the foundational economy can be missing. No bank, pub, corner shop, or just any shop. This makes it more difficult for the community to succeed, prosper, to be resilient and to have a future. Gradually, other elements of our community may begin to disappear. The young lose touch with their roots and leave. But change is calling. In Ogwen, Ffestiniog and Nantlle, social enterprises have been regenerating these communities following the end of the industrial era of the quarries. Today, our three communities are working together through the Dollan project to venture and develop, to create and learn together. This is Dollan. Community co-venturing in the foundational economy, to create communities where we can live successfully. Dollan.
Okay, so that was a short video prepared by a local young artist and a local musician with us here at Dollan. And the idea is that we can communicate what the foundational economy is and why it's important to the people in our communities who maybe are not so familiar with the terms as we've become. So I've got a small presentation here now, and so I'm going to share my screen again. Okay.
Dollan.
Right. Okay, so our project was born really from a pre-existing relationship where we were able to recognise the opportunity which was made available to us through the Foundational Economy Challenge Fund. We are Partneriaeth Ogwen, Cwmni Bro and yr Orsaf, and we represent the communities of Bethesda, Blaenau Ffestiniog and Manlla. Within our own communities, we have developed social enterprise as a response to the social and economic development needs of our communities. So naturally, each enterprise has developed in a different way, but crucially, each has been successful in their own communities. This highlights two main points for us, as we have much that we can learn from each other, and there is expertise and value in the sharing of our knowledge and experience, and that our approach needs to be driven by our communities in which we operate in order to succeed. Knowing what the answer is isn't enough. You have to know how to get there. So, we recognise the benefits of a stable foundational economy, but we know that right now our foundational economy is mostly extractive. This means that someone else, somewhere else, is benefiting from the incredible resilience of our communities, which creates this low risk and stable foundational economy. We want to turn this around. As social enterprises, we understand the interdependence of community and economy. That's why, when developing new initiatives, we will develop the local foundational economy and develop and strengthen the communities together. But not all foundational economy units are the same. Some of what is foundational is also an economic catalyst, can be high-end, the best quality, or the next best thing. Imagine if we'd caught mobile phones in the early 2000s. There's no denying a major player here for us is green, renewable, community, micro-generation of energy, owned and purchased by the community, domestic and business. Technology serviced by the community and innovations developed in our own maker spaces and sold to the world. And we believe Wales can be leading here. In the same way, not all economic activity produces the same intensity of social impact. Tourism is a key sector in our bit of Wales, and tourism affects our identity, our confidence, and how we value ourselves, our communities. Developing a healthy, community-centric tourism is a big winner for us. One aspect of moving towards a community tourism might be, how do we enable our tourism businesses and enterprises to ensure that they are able to provide local, well-paid, permanent and full-time jobs? And that's not easy, and it's definitely not easy in tourism. We know that sometimes change takes time, and real change takes effort too, and the leap of faith is so much harder than one small step forward. And it is difficult, because where do you start? We often hear we can't pay better wages. Our sector is seasonal and no one wants to be here in the cold and rain. Tourists want what they're used to, which are all partly true, I guess. So here's what we've done so far to start moving in the right direction at least. We've developed our idea of what community tourism looks like, and this is all on our website if you want to go and have a look. And we're working on breaking that right down into small, achievable steps. We're embedding these ideas and values in our first joint project and creating an economic catalyst that benefits our communities, responding to the dreaded plague of homes being lost to the likes of Airbnb in our towns and villages with no benefit at all feeding back to us. Hopefully, we will create an example of excellence. We've held online events to bring together this sector and created a network of established and new businesses to create a platform and to enable us to learn from each other. And we've responded to those conversations. We've committed to developing a permanent online platform which allows for marketing on our terms without sacrificing our USP. We've worked with partners and projects who understand, like we do, that our greatest asset is us, our culture, our language, our history, our land, and our communities. We are confident that through working together, we can develop an offering that allows us to respond to the need to extend the night stay visit, cash spent on local produce, work with local businesses, without selling ourselves cheap. And because we won't sacrifice on our long-term values and vision, we know that this work will lead to better jobs, not just more. And social enterprises looking to create social impact and economic success in parallel. So why do we bother with pre-existing businesses who are profit-driven? Well, we know that Wales has a missing middle when it comes to business and enterprise that make up the Welsh economy. We know that grounded firms anchored in place are far more likely to be community-minded, long-term employers, and bring with them a host of benefits. It doesn't seem achievable that we can, in this time frame, create a number of medium-sized enterprises and businesses with a culture driven by the need to create a positive social change. So what can we do? Firstly, let's look at what we've got. And what we've got is many, many small and micro businesses. Businesses that are, by their very nature, as much a social business as any. Often, they don't want to grow and don't need to be continuously on the cutting edge. And they value, beyond anything else, their relationship with their community. How do we allow them to maintain their identity, their independence, but give our economy the benefits of that missing middle? How do we get them to behave like medium-sized enterprises? There's a massive amount of work to be done here, but we're hoping that by facilitating the development and growth of networks, we can start, build relationships, highlight points in common, and create partnerships, and maybe even joint ventures. We don't always need to be trying to do something else or be someone else. We just need to enable what we've got to reach its full potential. So this is just a quick, really quick flyby of what Dolan's getting up to. Our major driver is that we can see through the framing of the foundational economy and using social enterprise as a vehicle that we can have a truly staggering impact on our communities. We know that from experience, we know that from our success so far. Thank you very much. And that's it from us, I think, and it just gives us a little idea of what's going on up here. And there's so much other stuff going on, and I'm hoping when we do the question and answer session, we'll get loads of questions and we can chat about the other aspects of our project and the other things that are going on in the other communities, because it's really very exciting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Elin. As you say, there clearly is a lot going on. I was also really struck by the little sort of cartoon you had at the beginning, which I thought was a very eloquent illustration, actually, of how the foundational economy and practice is so intertwined with community life, which I think makes quite a seamless link into Sophie Howe, who's going to be our final speaker for this morning, even. Where again, I'm really pleased that, you know, Sophie is making those links between how actually an effective economy that works for everyone, an effective foundational economy, is so crucial also to our well-being, which I think in historic discussion, you know, our concept of economy and well-being has been so far apart. So very keen now to hear what Sophie's going to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Debbie. And yes, I mean, that's absolutely right. The Future Generations Act puts a completely different slant on the way that we think about the economy through that goal of a prosperous Wales, and the way in which it links to other wellbeing goals around improving people's physical and mental health, cohesive communities, addressing inequality and socioeconomic disadvantage, whilst also sort of acting within planetary boundaries and recognising the kind of climate and nature emergency that we're within. So, you know, foundational economy is totally in line with the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So I think that there are some challenges around the use of new terminology, and it's really important that we don't see this as something separate, a different initiative which is different to the Future Generations Act is absolutely core. And I think the video from Dolan really explained it quite simply and really well. But for me, it's basically where the money that we spend supports the social infrastructure we need, and profits and benefit goes back into the community. So I think with that kind of overarching legislative context of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which I always remind people, still we are only the only country in the world to have something as comprehensive and all-encompassing, focusing on both on what we do now for the benefit of current generations and for future generations. It's no surprise then that in that context that the government are really focusing on the development of the foundational economy, and what we now need to see is that real kind of progress from policy into action, as Lee said. And I think there are some positive developments in that regard, and a lot of that, as with many positive and also sadly many negative, things have kind of accelerated during COVID. But there were different paths and different approaches being taken within the context of the foundational economy, recognising the importance of local community infrastructure and so on to meeting our wellbeing goals even prior to COVID. So we've seen Monmouthshire Council, for example, become the first local authority in Wales to take on the running of a post office. Why are they doing that? Well, actually, if you think more broadly about their objectives on health, for example, those wider determinants of health, about 19% of what makes a difference to health inequalities is nothing to do with what the NHS, well, it's about 10% to do with what the NHS do. 90% is about social cohesion, social interaction, relationships. So when you start thinking then about the importance of that kind of community infrastructure, it becomes immediately obvious and immediately kind of, well, why aren't we all doing it? That post office is that kind of fabric of that social infrastructure. So absolutely, a local authority who has duties towards the well-being of their citizens should be thinking about those kind of innovative solutions. Likewise, housing associations very much in this territory prior to COVID. Cartrefi Conway set up a social enterprise, a modular housing construction factory, helping to meet our housing need in a more effective way, and doing that by providing skills and jobs for local people in a way where profits and benefits go back into the community. The Powys Pound, where they've seen a 4% increase over the last 2 years in spending, both in Powys and then in Wales. So 56% of their spend in Powys is in Wales. And around 30% directly in Powys. And we're also increasingly seeing approaches to the foundational economy and procurement from public bodies taking into account environmental considerations. I'm going to heavily caveat that with we have a significantly long way to go. And, as Lee alluded to, not all of our public bodies are in the right space there, but the power of our future generations calling current generations out. In Monmouthshire, I know there's been a similar issue that Lee has been involved in his patch. School children were calling out the local authority saying, why are we having our milk delivered in cartons, which are not recyclable, and why aren't we having, why isn't it local milk and why isn't it delivered in bottles? And the council have changed their procedures. There was a lot to kind of wade through, but it's now being sourced locally, it's being delivered in milk bottles and so on. Carmarthenshire Council building all their schools to passive house standards. Obviously that raises the question, if some can do it, why can't everyone do it? And I think that, again, some of the issues that have been flagged and that we've identified through the review of procurement, which we're in the middle of, a kind of pause during the lockdown period, but picking that up again now, our early findings in terms of that review, probably won't be surprising to any of you, but leadership is a real problem. Leaders in public bodies often seem to view procurement as some sort of dark arts and wizardry, which happens in the bowels of a procurement department, which nobody really understands. Actually, they need to be seeing that as core to their business. They need to be questioning, challenging, and showing leadership on where they spend their money and how that actually happens. Resourcing is an issue. So our procurement professionals are up against the cosh, as with many of those departments in public services that are not seen as kind of delivering key frontline services. They've been decimated during austerity. They do not necessarily have the support to think in a broader way and the resources to enable that to happen. And never one to blow smoke up politicians' backside, but actually I think that Lee is one of the few politicians who is interested in the mechanics of why we are not getting things right, why the policies are not working, rather than just making new high-level policy announcements. And for me, that kind of resourcing, that support is absolutely crucial, and that challenge to leadership. I think some of the other challenges are around the kind of complex landscape that we're operating within. There's a gazillion frameworks, toolkits, there's a Future Generations Act, there's a foundational economy, there's an ethical supply chain guidance, there's a whole manner of things. And how does all of that fit together? Well, I suppose I would say this, wouldn't I? But we've gone to the trouble of making a groundbreaking, world-leading piece of legislation which covers everything. So we must ensure that that overarching framework is the Future Generations Act, and the toolkits, the guidance, if they're needed, fit within that context and aren't diverting attention elsewhere. And then the sort of final thing, which links back to all of those other points that I've raised around the challenges, is that often the devil is in the detail. So we can have kind of high-level commitments around local spend, we can have high-level commitments around the creation of jobs and training opportunities, we can have high-level commitments around environmental targets and requirements. But often what we see is that those things happen, but what actually presents itself and doesn't necessarily follow suit. One of my biggest bugbears is the development of Central Square in Cardiff. So if any of you come on the train to our capital city, you walk out of the train station and you're met with a concrete slab and a pret-a-manger. That is not the vision that we're aiming to create for Wales. It is not a vision of a foundational economy. It is not a vision of enhancing biodiversity and nature. It's not a vision of that kind of community cohesion. So when I say the small things are important, I think all of those things add up to how do we feel about how we're doing things in Wales. Would you come into Wales and say, there's something different here, there's a focus on community, there's the focus on SMEs, there's the focus on supporting businesses who put things back into the community. I think that in terms of COVID, as I said, we've seen a rapid acceleration in a number of future trends. So home working, obviously, when I was that futures woman banging on about, the M4 and how actually, there was this ongoing trend towards home working. Some people were saying, yeah, but it's never going to happen, or it'll take ages, and so on. And okay, maybe I didn't anticipate a kind of global pandemic accelerating that, but we have seen huge decreases in people travelling, starting to increase a bit now. But also, the ability of everyone's homework. We would never have been having this. It would have taken months and, all sorts of IT nightmares to organise something like this just 6 months ago. And now this is our daily norm. And so I think that presents new opportunities. And again, we've seen the Guardian article recently reporting a 69% increase in local shopping, people using their local shops and so on. If we are all working closer to home, what could that mean in terms of support for the foundational economy? What could that mean in terms of organisations thinking of doing things differently? One of the things that I'm thinking about for my staff who are all still working from home is, should I be giving a foundational economy grant to them so that they can spend in local shops? I'm going to be saving money in the longer term on my office accommodation. profession. I want my staff to be out there in coffee shops and interacting with local communities. Is there a way that I can support that? And if every public body in Wales did that, what boost would that give to the local economy? But we've seen, you know, during COVID, and again, this is because of a real political focus, not just on the policy, but on the detail of implementation, real strides in terms of where, how PPE is being sourced from the foundational economy. We've seen councils like RCT providing small grants to organisations and individuals who are doing valuable things in the community. And I don't think we can underestimate the power of that happening, or the power that that's kind of, that brings, because sometimes I think we overcomplicate things in a system of, you know, of our bureaucracies, of our organisations, of our processes and procedures. But actually sometimes the biggest difference that can be made are those small things, recognising the good things that are going on in communities and finding way for our public services to support them. So I suppose kind of where next is the question. I think there's certainly something about us moving to you know, I've heard it described as Foundation FE 2.0, which, yeah, I can see why it's called that, but perhaps it's just another name to kind of confuse people. But essentially, I think the foundational economy has focused in large parts on supporting social infrastructure, jobs, training, getting money back into local economies. That's absolutely brilliant. We need to do more of that. We need to do that better. We also, however, need to make sure that we're doing that within planetary boundaries. So we really now need to be joining up the dots between the opportunities to create local jobs in a way which also supports the environment. So huge opportunities, for example, around forestry, huge opportunities around investment that the government, I think, have made and are likely to increasingly be making around housing retrofit. But it's really important that we're joining the dots there, because if we're going to meet those wider priorities and objectives through the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, so priorities and objectives to reduce inequality and socio-economic disadvantage, priorities to reduce our carbon emissions, to increase the number of people who have access to skills which will enable them to access decent jobs and fair work. We need to be thinking about the foundational economy holistically. So when we're procuring and spending in terms of housing retrofit, how have we thought about where those jobs are going and who those jobs are going to? Do we have the skills in the system already or in the pipeline already? And I'm not sure that we do. And even if we do, are all of those people who are skilled up in those areas to go into those new jobs white men, or are they helping, or are we focusing on bringing in a more diverse range of people with access to those skills so that we are reducing inequality in our BAME communities with disabled people, with women and so on? And then in terms of our kind of future trends, I often think that although, I think our government is quite progressive in many ways in its nature, we're often trying to solve existing problems without recognising what might be coming down the line at us, so future trends and scenarios. So challenges with social care, for example, when we've got double the number of over 65s by 2036, what does that mean in terms of how we value care? What does that look like in a foundational economy context? Climate change, who's going to be hit hardest from that? What can we be doing now through foundational economy work, as I said, to be really focusing on that next phase of how we take that forward within planetary boundaries? What are the skills that we need for the future, and how do we match that with the work that we're doing on the foundational economy? Things like food, really pleased to see that there is this focus on food, but if, one thing that COVID has taught us is about the insecurity of our food system. But I think, looking at the evidence around that, food could be an absolutely critical thing to supporting local business, to addressing socioeconomic disadvantage, to improving the health of our communities. and individuals within them, and to improving the cohesiveness of communities. So we should be looking for those things that have the kind of opportunity for multiple benefits. And we should also be looking at those things which are perhaps on the periphery of foundational economy policy, but could make a difference. So the 20-minute neighbourhoods, a recommendation in my Future Generations report. I met with someone from the SNP last week who are taking forward 20-minute neighbourhoods through their government as well. What difference could that make to how we interact locally, how we spend locally, and indeed the sorts of services and social infrastructure, therefore, that needs to be provided locally? What difference could a UBI and a reduced working week make to the ability of people to spend locally and interact and contribute locally within their communities? How can we help communities to help themselves? Some really interesting examples, a community in Clapham, not in London, in rural England, who have worked together and have built a fibre optic network to deliver internet connections to their rural communities. So they're now running at about 1,000 megabytes per second internet connection, which is one of the best across the whole of the UK. How can we learn from not just the good stuff that's going on in Wales, but some of those broader things elsewhere? So I'm kind of quite positive about this. I think there now needs to be this concerted effort to sit this within the context of these. If you're doing the foundational economy, you need to do it in a way which embraces all aspects of our wellbeing goals. And if you're doing it, you'll also, in that way, you'll also be meeting your requirements within the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And, you know, quite frankly, creating, you know, better local communities and a better Wales for both current and future generations. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Sophie. I think that's a really good concluding and very wide-ranging presentation from Sophie, covering a lot of the issues. We've got a short break coming up, about 5 minutes. We're still looking to take questions. We've had a few questions submitted in the question and answer box, but not that many. So this is your opportunity to get some more in. Otherwise, you risk having the panelists and the academics and me as chair chipping in and asking questions instead. So please do keep those coming in. If you want to actually raise the question yourself, please preface it by talk. We're going to sign off for about 5 minutes now and see you back for a question and answer session after that. Thanks all very much. Okay, welcome back everybody. We have some questions in the Q&A box, and we also have some questions I think that we'd like to ask. Ian in particular wanted to kick off and has a question for all the panelists. Ian, are you happy to ask your question?
Yeah, so thanks, Debbie. I'm going to abuse my position and ask one each if I can. First of all, just to say thank you very much to all three speakers for really good presentations. I was particularly struck by Lee. It was really good to hear a minister talk about the difficulties of the machinery of government and needing to look at new ways, communities of practice to trial and to experiment. That was very refreshing. So thanks to Lee for that. So my question to him was similar to the one I asked Rachel Reeves, is that I fully understand the need for fast wins, but much of this work will be long term. And so, you know, how you balance that need for being able to show that we have successes, but also nurturing projects that will take a lot longer than a normal political cycle to come to fruition. My question to Elin was, well, first of all, a comment was, I really liked that video, and Fabrizio Barca yesterday emphasised the need to bring citizens along and to appeal to moral sentiments. So I think that's great work, Elin. But I think you said something really intriguing about the missing middle. So I just wondered whether you could say a bit more about giving examples of how you try to bring together small companies and firms to try and address that problem. And then lastly to Sophie, and this is from someone who is very committed to future generations, is how future generations work can address the here and now in terms of low pay and poor working conditions for people in foundational sector jobs. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And I think my sort of reflections are really is that, you know, though the foundational economy is a fairly simple and seductive concept, it's devilishly complicated in trying to implement it, because it is a very ambitious one. It is about culture change. It's about practice change. It's about attitudes. And I wouldn't be overly concerned, Ian, about the focus on quick wins, because there's nothing bloody quick about it, I can tell you. You know, moving this machine is very very challenging. Capacity is one of our biggest problems. The number of people who are directly working on this is very small, and that's, you know, true in almost any policy area in the Welsh Government. This is one of the things I think people misunderstand about the Welsh Government, is its size. Really, we're trying to do a lot of things with not many people. And that is very difficult. What we really need to do, obviously, is to change the practice of the practitioners, and that's you know, that's the prize. So the work that we are currently doing, and I am permanently frustrated as a minister. Is, you know, and you know, this is not a experience unique to me. I think most ministers are frustrated at the pace of change. We have now got to the stage where CLES, the Centre for Local Economic Strategies in Manchester, who did the work with Preston and others, have delivered the first cut of the procurement spend analysis to public service boards. So we wrote out to all public service boards asking them to take part in this, and we've had an agreement from the Gwent cluster, the Cwmni cluster, Carmarthenshire, Ceredigion and Powys working together, and Denbighshire and Conwy, though I think there's an interest in the whole of the North Wales Ambition Board joining in. So we've delivered them the sort of supply void analysis, and that, for example, in food is showing that 51% of food procured by the public sector in Wales is procured from inside Wales, 49% from outside Wales. And this is a very fragile sector post-Brexit with significant potential for job losses unless we shift something. But of course, as Carol Williams rightly points out, this postcode analysis masks all sorts of other things. So for example, within that 49% is spend covered by Castell Hywel, for example, in my own patch in Cross Hands. But I think I'm right in saying that only something like 8% of the people Castell Hywel buy from are within Wales. So that figure is misleading and it's seductive and making things look okay. But actually, once you drill down, it shows a far more complex picture. So getting into that and changing that requires multiple points of interruption and disruption, both with the suppliers themselves, and then with the people who commission it, and so on. So it's getting into the nitty-gritty of it that really makes a difference of this, and there are multiple points of nitty-gritty to delve into, and that is what is so challenging about it. So we've taken three-pronged approach. So we've got our 52 experimental funds, we've got our public service board procurement work, and then we've got the missing middle grounded firms work. So Business Wales in its current form comes to an end with the end of European funding, and we have to recast Business Wales and refund it. And we are working through the Foundational Economy Ministerial Advisory Board that Debbie chairs, that Carol sits on, and others on this call, no doubt. We are working with Business Wales to influence the way that new service looks, so it has a greater emphasis on supporting SMEs to grow, and then addressing the question of ownership in the medium to longer term with the potential of employee buyouts and co-ops and so on. All of these things are slow in gestation. Not sure if I've answered your question, Ian, but that's the start.
Thanks, Lee. Is Elin able to address some examples on the missing middle?
Yeah, so we're very aware here of that idea of the missing middle, and understanding the increased value that we would get from medium-sized enterprises grounded in our communities and the benefits that that would bring to our communities. But we're also very aware that the makeup of our communities are a larger number of small enterprise or even micro enterprises. And that's where people are comfortable within our communities, and that's where the enterprising nature is able to show itself, and that's really important. And I think, you know, by enforcing this idea that we must grow and that we must join into one company, it demotivates our people, and it demotivates our citizens to think that being enterprising is something that someone does somewhere else, instead of identifying it as something that you can do within a micro business. But that doesn't help us with needing this missing middle. So what we're looking at is, how do you allow people to cooperate? How do you allow them to work together as independent businesses without losing their culture, without losing their independence, but also without feeling like they've been pushed out of their comfort zone? Because, you know, a lot of these businesses are structured like this because they allow people to have the income and the lifestyle that they want. And they don't necessarily want to have employees, they don't necessarily want to have a larger workplace, they don't necessarily want any of those extra responsibilities that comes with growth, and they have the level of and the lifestyle that suits them. So we recognise that it's a lot to do with facilitation, coordinating meetings, allowing people to be in the same space, and just that allowing of people to be in the same space and to be in a positive space, where they're able to communicate with each other, is often really beneficial, because we get this overflow of, oh gosh, you know, it's so good to hear you say it, and this idea I've got, and talking together and seeing that they're not a threat to each other, and that actually together they can be stronger and they can make real steps towards what their original ideas with their businesses were. So, you know, it's a really complicated area, but I think, and where we're going with it, with this idea of facilitating people coming together, it is literally just the first step in allowing enterprises and businesses to see and to understand and have a real internal idea of what the layout of their sector is within the local community. It's just the beginning of doing that. And I think, you know, linking people, what we found with the tourism events that we ran on the tourism sector was that it was really good to see all these enterprises that were running, you know, micro businesses, but micro experiences as well, and thinking, oh, actually we can link up with each other and provide something that suits the customer better. And at the end of the day, that's going to allow us to extend nights per stay and all this kind of stuff. And it's the same with, you know, hopefully we'll be able to develop the same kind of thing with small enterprises that work within, you know, plumbers, electricians, that kind of thing, that are going to allow them to go for these larger contracts by working together. But it's that facilitation between the organisations, between the firms, and that's a really necessary thing. And it's difficult to see right at this time how that'll develop, but it's certainly something that we need to develop. And it's a real gap that social enterprises can step into, because it's a way of exaggerating the community aspects of these small micro enterprises by facilitating their cooperation. through social enterprise, which is in itself obviously has social drivers behind it. So that's really exciting. But it would be foolish to think that we have the answers. We don't. But what we do recognise is that by allowing people to come together, we're going to create something, and we'll see what that is and try and facilitate that. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question at all.
I mean, that's really interesting. Yeah, not one solution. So,
yeah.
Thank you. Sophie.
Yes, you asked me to cover how the Future Generations Act could, in the here and now, could sort of address issues around low pay for, in the FE sector. I mean, I think that, the requirements of the legislation are clear, but also very difficult to do because they are so all-encompassing. So procurement, for example, is listed as one of the areas that change should be happening in terms of the business of public bodies. It's very clear that public bodies should be using the way in which they procure goods, services and infrastructure and so on to drive progress towards their wellbeing objectives. But from our the first phase of our review, we can see that that is not happening. So public bodies are not making the connection with I've got a wellbeing objective over here to to ensure that there's a skilled and well-educated sort of community of access to good jobs, and to tackle poverty and to reduce health inequalities. They are not making the connections between how then do they commission their social care and what does that mean for the workforce of the social care services that they're commissioning, and what requirements therefore should they be putting through that contract to enable them to contribute to the meeting those broader objectives that they've set. And I think Lee's point, really, this is about the nitty gritty. This is about tracking through how the detail of every procurement decision and policy decision that you make, how that is going to help you meet your wellbeing objectives. And they're not doing that effectively at the moment. Some of them are getting there, but then they're not doing it very effectively. I hope so. In terms of kind of solutions for that, I'd like to think that the support that's being provided through Claire's will eventually get to that point. But I think it's really important that that's done in a holistic way. So it's not just focused down on how can we increase the proportion of goods and services that are procured within this area or within this region. We then have to go down to the next level and say, and what does that actually look like? How is that driving progress? How is that addressing low pay? How is that making sure that we're reducing our carbon emissions? How is that helping to restore nature? So on and so on. So it's really that kind of quite detailed look across it all. You'll be aware that the Social Partnership Bill is currently sort of in development, and the intention there is that there will be some more specific duties on public bodies around procurement, and I met with the team this week to discuss that. I think that will be helpful in terms of putting some more meat on the bone in terms of what the actual requirements are around how we procure and how we do that in a way which facilitates decent work or fair work. And the bill itself is picking up on the recommendations of the Fair Work Commission. But again, what I reiterated to them is it's important that we don't push out another piece of legislation which just says, oh, you now need to procure in a way which secures fair work, without forgetting all of the other things that we need to do. What we need is a comprehensive, and I'm not a fan of toolkits, frameworks or process, but we need a comprehensive approach of all public bodies demonstrating how they're doing their policy and their procurement, that they have given consideration to what more they could do across all of the elements of wellbeing, and they need the support to do that. And then they also need the challenge, which is one of the reasons why I'm doing this procurement review, but also challenge back from government and others, so who need to be testing whether that's being done before money is given out. So I know to a large degree, the way in which public bodies procure is, the local authorities will procure from their own budgets, likewise health services, but we can't underestimate the power of Welsh Government challenging them as well and stopping funding for certain programmes outside of their kind of core funding if they can't demonstrate how they've applied the Future Generations Act and in turn use the foundational economy and ensure that fair work and all other aspects are considered there. At the moment, I'm not sure that that's happening as comprehensively as it should be.
Yeah, Ian, can I just come back on something Sophie said, just to try and open up a discussion on this? Because I think, what's interesting in the experience I've had recently is we are, the procurement professionals are not malign people, and there is some really good practice going on. I think we need to acknowledge that. But to be fair to them, they are dealing with competing policy priorities, and very often, it is convenient for different parts of the system, including ministers, who rarely get involved in the detail of this anyway. But for these not to be resolved at the decision-making level, but to just kick the can down the road and let somebody else get their head around it. So, for example, say PPE procurement, which is the area I've been spending most time worrying about recently. So we've currently got a set of orders going in for something called FFP3 masks. So these are quite high-end, heavy filtration masks. We do now have capacity in Wales to make them here, but there's a whole system of fit testing and safety standards to go through, which takes time. Meanwhile, we have got doctors, nurses, clinicians who need these masks. So we simply are not in the position to say, well, we'll wait for a Welsh firm to be able to provide these, because we need them now, especially if we're heading into a second peak. So the procurement professionals are under pressure to secure supply lines, but they're under countervailing pressure from me to get Welsh firms involved in this, and they're stuck in the middle of that. And so, not unreasonably, they want to put a long order in to make sure we've got what we need. So there's a job of work now, I think, as for us to is to try and manage these things in parallel. So we adjust the balance live, and so we make sure our primary priority is to make sure we've got the supply lines and the stock secure. But as we ramp up Welsh production and the quality and capacity, and the quality isn't always there. It's not overly romanticized local grounded firms. We need to make sure that there are exceptions. But I'm just saying we shouldn't just assume that that's the case. We need to ramp up their ability to meet that need, whilst then gradually ramping down. But obviously we enter into long-term contracts, and that's one example of where what Sophie makes a general statement about, which is fine in the round, but in the detailed practice of it, these are complex, and also cost is a driver. So we are putting pressure on the health service to bring productivity wins, to make sure that public money goes as far as it can. So you've got procurement professionals under one countervailing pressure to get a low price, but another pressure to do social procurement, so social value. So so these are hard judgments, and we've got a profession who are understaffed, undervalued, not often plugged in, as Kevin Morgan often makes the point that procurement is seen as a backroom function and not as a boardroom function. They report to a head of finance, or they report to a functional part of the organization, not the regeneration part, for example. So again, these are easy grand statements to make, but once you get into the detail of it, there are complex balances at play that we need to work through.
I completely agree with that, but I think the PPE issue is it's an emergency, isn't it? And who would have been in a position this time last year, or probably you would need longer than that, to be gearing up your Welsh supply chain around PPE. Not very many people would have had that foresight, I wouldn't have thought. However, there are millions and millions of things that are procured on an ongoing basis that we know we're going to need, that we have not done the work to develop the supply chain, and that we are, we're just not doing what we need to do. So we're not taking that sort of longer term approach and doing what you described there, which is, get the supply chain in the right place, make sure it's sort of fit for purpose, make sure that, every sort of benefit we can get through that supply chain is being considered, line up your procurement professionals to understand where that is, get your leadership on board. It is a long chain, but I don't think there's any way around that long chain. And I'm just going to give you an example. This week I also met with the people who have won the contract to deliver through the mutual investment model all of Welsh schools for the next, I think it's 10 or 15 years or so on. And my question then to government is, what requirements have you put on them? What is your ask of them? Are they being required to build schools which are zero carbon? Are they being required to use local firms to do that? What's the input of the foundational economy? So I completely get, and I sort of feel Lee's frustration, because when you wade into the nitty gritty, it's like a nightmare. It's like wading through treacle. But there does also have to be that high level demand, requirement and leadership from Welsh Government right across everything that you procure to say, this is the standard that we expect, and this is what we expect you to be doing, and we're going to be going back in and checking if you do.
Very much for that, Sophie. I can see that Elin is bursting to come in as well. And then we've got a question from Amy in the audience, which is also on procurement. So it seems an opportune time for Amy to be brought in after Elin's had a chance to speak. Thanks, Elin.
I just wanted to put a kind of, to bring it down a few levels to actually how our experience of how this works on the ground. And from our experience, that there's a number of things that do work in parallel with it. There's this idea of risk, isn't there? So if small enterprises or a conglomerate of small enterprises or a cooperative want to go for these contracts that allow local authorities to procure locally, there's a risk involved that's going to fall on them if they've moved too far out of their comfort zone, that it doesn't work out, and that even if it's just a perception of risk of moving into this area, it's definitely, it becomes a real risk because of that. And there's work that needs to be done in allowing and enabling local organisations, businesses and enterprises to make that step and to make that leap. And that responsibility for removing that risk should be with government and should be with local government, and not with these small businesses. Otherwise it's never going to be removed. On the other side, our experience of working with local authorities is that individually people do want to buy locally. They are part of this community, and they see the obvious benefits in making sure that money goes round in a circle, and that we increase the local economy. But they feel that they are not able to. So this idea again of who can take responsibility for removing those barriers, and who should. It's government, it's local government should spend that time in thinking about how do we remove those barriers and enabling people who are individuals at the end of the day to understand and have the confidence to think about how do we create workarounds, how do we answer this in a way that we're able to within this structure. And the idea of risk of failure is massive, especially when you've got local government who are having to make cutbacks all over the place at the moment, and people are feeling under pressure, they're feeling under threat, and possibly that their jobs are under threat, so that they're going for naturally safety, and they don't have the confidence to make changes. It's passive change. So I think that's really important, and I think that idea of confidence works right the way up to local government then, and what Sophie was saying about putting these things in place and saying, if you want to win this contract, then you have to do this, this and this as well. That again is a matter of confidence, and I think hopefully the Welsh Government will gain confidence there when they can see that our economy within Wales is something that can support them. So it works both ways, I think, if that makes sense.
Thank you very much for that, Ellen. I think that's a really good practical illustration. Amy, you also had a question on procurement. So if you'd like to ask your question, and maybe if you've got particular panelists you'd like to answer the question, can you let us know that as well? And then they'll attempt to answer. Thank you.
Yes. Okay, thanks. So Elin, you and I, great minds think alike. I was going to ask a similar point that you just made. And I think it's really, what I picked up from what the Deputy Minister and the Future Generations Commissioner were saying was that the answer to a healthy foundational economy sounds like it needs to be about renovating the procurement system. And so I think the first half of my question is this what we are really looking for in terms of a healthy foundational economy? And it might be that any of the panel would like to answer that, or even that Ian might want to wade in and say something as well. Now, with my background, having been involved in a small Welsh cooperative that was negotiating its way around all of the different procurement services across Wales in the public sector, I find it very reassuring that this huge focus on procurement is happening, because basically what we're really asking of the public sector is to do the kind of thing that I'm already doing as a personal shopper. When I go shopping, I try to shop ethically, I try to shop locally and from independent sources. And so that's really what we're asking them to do. But one of the problems that I think we might see there is that the public sector have been trying to incorporate that into their procurement systems, but it tends to be a little bit of a tick box where they'll just say, okay, they've said something about shopping ethically, they've said something about the foundational economy, therefore tick, that box is done. But actually when it comes down to making the decisions in terms of procurement, it all comes down to cost. So I think Lee was very much picking up on that just now. In my own research, I've been focused very much on how you achieve institutional change. And there's some understanding within academia about this notion of path dependency, that we just get stuck in doing things the way that they have always been done. And what we really need to do is have some kind of focus on the agency to achieve that change. So Elin, this is where what you were saying ties in with what I was going to ask, which was, who do we actually need to instigate the change in procurement systems? And there is a danger, I think, which Lee was picking up on, in terms of asking the people that have a vested interest in keeping procurement systems the way that they are. There's a danger in asking them to instigate the change. So my question really is, who do we need to instigate change, but also to consider what obstructs change in procurement systems? So there's threefold questions there. Is what we're looking for in a healthy foundational economy simply a change to procurement? Who do we need to instigate that change? And what obstructs change from taking place? In my own research, one of the obstructions has been the lack of willingness or the lack of allocation of responsibility to actually instigate that change. So this question goes out to anyone within the panel. Thank you.
Can I start? I'll just address one aspect of it, which is procurement and the foundational economy the same thing? Because it's not. But one of the attractions of tackling procurement is that it's easy to explain. And I think one of the real difficulties we have with the foundational economy is explaining it as a concept in everyday language to people who aren't involved in these debates. And we've been doing some work with Joe Earl, who was one of the authors of the Foundational Economy Collective book on language and understanding people's understanding of the economy. And clearly understanding is very low. It's low amongst policymakers. It's not, you know, it's not the best way to describe it, I don't think. We've toyed around with everyday economy, which Rachel Reeves has been talking about. I think that's a better way of describing it. But that is one of the things that we are looking at through the work of the MAB group that Debbie chairs, as a better way of explaining it. Talking about the procurement is a way that illustrates part of what we're trying to do well, I think, because people can get their head around, you know, why are we buying carrots from Glasgow for schools in Carmarthenshire when Carmarthenshire is the best place to grow carrots? for example. People think that's crackers. And that's why focusing on PPE in food is I think, a sensible place to start for a number of reasons, but one of them being is it makes sense to people. It illustrates what we're trying to do. But I think, you know, the challenge fund projects go way beyond procurement. I think there's about a dozen of them involved in procurement of the 52. The rest are about changing the way the foundational economy works. And for me, this is a really important sort of conceptual point as well, because one of the, you know, I've been advocating for a foundational economy approach since I was elected 4 years ago. And the resistance that I faced before coming into government and since coming into government from officials and from others is that the foundational economy is associated with being low skill, low wage, low productivity. And so we talk about mundane as a good thing, but people who've been programmed to accelerate Wales's significant productivity problem don't see mundane as a plus. So they're sort of scratching their heads. You know, why are we focusing on this thing that's dragging us down when we should be focusing on something that's going to pull us up? And I think it's really important, and the message I've tried to say is that this isn't about replicating the worst aspects of those parts of the economy that are captured by the foundational term. It's about disrupting the way they work. You know, why should the food sector, the care sector be about low pay, low skill, and an analog approach to service delivery? They shouldn't be. So we need to decouple, you know, so skills officials will say, you know, we need to focus on level 4, level 5 skills, because they're the bits that add value to the economy, not on level 2. And, you know, that's bollocks. But it's, you know, it is a deeply held belief. So I think it's a really important part of the foundational economy. We don't get hooked up on procurement, important a part as it is, because it's, for me, the real challenge of the foundational economy agenda is about disrupting the way it works and adding those, addressing its weaknesses. The foundational economy can do all of those things. There's no reason why AI development couldn't be in some of these mundane sectors. In fact, they must be, and that's got to be part of our approach.
Should I come in? Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Elin.
I completely, oh, sorry. Did you want Elin to come in first? No,
no, Sophie. Sorry, Sophie, go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with Lee, really. I think it's, you know, it's a complex picture, and there's no one thing. You know, I think the question was what is it that kind of drives change? But I think you need a whole range of things. So you need to start from leadership, and I think that the Welsh Government are giving that at a strategic level in some areas, and I think the leadership then needs to flow right across government. So what Lee is saying needs to become the mantra of every minister in terms of the way that they do their business. And I think, you know, having been in government myself as an advisor, I can see why that's challenging, because I'm quite fascinated really about the extent to which Lee is getting into the nitty-gritty, which is really, you know, ministers in some ways can't do that because they're up here taking these strategic decisions, but in a way they absolutely need to do that, because that's why things are not happening. You need to understand the nitty-gritty of why things aren't happening. So there's something about that kind of cross-government leadership, and then leadership at a kind of local level, because if your chief executive is saying this is a priority to make this happen, these are our corporate objectives, and I want the way we do things to meet those corporate objectives, and I'm up for you taking some risk to meet those corporate objectives, and if it goes pear-shaped, I've got your back. That, I think, helps to create the culture of change. I think there's then the sort of, you know, the really practical stuff around the sort of, you know, resourcing for, you know, for bodies to do this, and the support, connecting them with each other, connecting them with best practice, connecting them with people who've done it before, and so on. And then I think there's the kind of, you know, there's also the challenge in the requirements. So you're not going to get money to do this unless you can demonstrate that you've done it in this particular way. I'll caveat that with some of the points made around tick boxing, which I think is a big problem. But that, for me, comes back into the nitty-gritty thing. Someone's got to be checking that it's not just tick boxing. So the sort of challenge and requirements to do this. And then I suppose just linking back to the kind of leadership and the culture of organisations, there's something about the culture of organisations in terms of trying to get as far down the organisation as you possibly can, this is what we're actually trying to achieve. Your role is, you know, and I know I agree with Lee that it's not just about procurement, but I'm going to just focus on that now. Your role is not just to ensure that we have met, you know, these procurement rules in going through this particular thing. Your role is helping us to achieve these objectives in terms of improving the health of the population and, you know, doing all of the various things that public bodies have set through their wellbeing objectives. So I think, you know, in any organisation, people understanding the part they play in that overall mission of the organisation is really critical as well.
Thank you, Sophie. And Elin, did you want to chip in on that as well?
Yeah, sure. So on the point of the foundational economy being only about procurement, it definitely isn't. From a community point of view, it's about everyday life, like we've heard, and it's about finding worth in everyday activities that fall within an economic, within the economy. So no, definitely not about procurement. It is an easy win for government and for local government, in the sense that it can be easy within the foundational economy, because like Lee said, nothing's quick and nothing's really easy. But yeah, it's easy to communicate over, so and potentially easy to make changes in comparison to other areas. So yeah, easy win. But there's a risk to run with that the idea of the foundational economy becomes very narrow. And there's a risk that we become blinkered to other aspects of the foundational economy and other things that can be done that have a massive impact on community life, which is where I'm coming from. So yeah, not just procurement by far. This idea of ticking boxes, I always think, rightfully or wrongly, ticking boxes is a symptom of people on the ground feeling out of their comfort zone, feeling like whatever it is that the boxes are, so whatever the idea is where they have to tick the boxes, is too big for them to understand. So they don't have a working understanding of what they're doing. So they tick the boxes because they feel under threat, that the idea is too big for them, so that they can get on to the next thing. If they understood the idea and they understood where they were with it, then they wouldn't be ticking boxes. They would be finding workarounds and making sure that it's a real thing from start to finish, because they'd have confidence in it again. And I know I use the word confidence a lot, but it's a real thing. And I think, you know, when we think about change and that kind of thing, the main thing for us is allowing people to see that it's possible, but allowing them as well to imagine and know what it looks like to have a foundational economy that feeds back into the local economy. And that's a massive piece of work as well. So, yeah.
Thank you very much for that, Elin. And if I can use my position as chair, we've had a bit of a discussion in the question and answer about how much is the foundational economy a sort of public sector project or within the remit of the public sector. And I think in some way that's analogous to how some of the discussion about foundational economy gets hung up on the issue of procurement. So I'm interested in both the panelists and also Kevin and Carol's views on how much of this is within the remit of the public sector or not, and who would like to kick off. If I can maybe, I know Lee had an answer to that, so if I can maybe pull in Lee and then ask Kevin and Carol for some quick comments.
Do you mind if I just pass straight on to Kevin and Carol, because I think you've heard enough from me and they've got interesting things to say.
So Kevin or Carol? Carol, shall I put you on the spot first? Or Kevin?
No, it's all right. I'm coming along. Wait a second. Right. Yes. Well, I think we discussed the fact that the foundational economy isn't procurement. It's many, many different things. The leading foundational economy sector in Wales is actually health in terms of employment, output, and all the rest. But health isn't in Lee's kind of departmental remit, so that's outside. And then there's the huge question of the private sector. And that subdivides into a whole series of separate problems. Elin was talking about bringing together local micro firms and SMEs, which I think is a very innovative and important approach in dealing with the world as it is. Because as Lee was saying, we have to build capability in micro and SME firms. And then there's the larger question of controlling big corporates, private equity owned firms and all the rest of that, which of course really isn't within the delegated capacity of Welsh Government, but would require some kind of social licensing which trickle down from Westminster. So there's a whole series of different boxes where different kinds of actors have to act in a coordinated way. And that, I think, is the real problem.
Thank you. And Kevin, did you want to chip in?
Yeah, I think this has been an extremely useful and very pertinent discussion. All I would say, I think the discussion and the question raise issues about sectors, capacity and culture. As regards the sectors, while the public sector can play a leading role, the foundational economy, to my mind, straddles public, private and civic sectors. In terms of private sector and civic sector, whether it's in social enterprise or co-ops, being able to supply dignified elder care, for example. So I don't think we should get hung up on which sector does what. The key issue, as Lee mentioned earlier, is calibre and quality of provision. In terms of the capacity issue, I put a question in earlier, which got lost somewhere, I guess, that all the agents in Wales lack capacity, particularly Welsh Government, and Lee has been very, very frank about the capacity constraints in Welsh Government. And therefore, in the foundational economy network, we've often suggested that the way forward is to make a virtue of necessity, that co-production must be the way forward for us in Wales, where we share our capacity so that we get ahead together. That should be the real motto in Wales going forward, it seems to me, getting ahead together through co-production. And that then raises the final issue, once again, Lee highlighted it, of culture. Anyone who has worked in or worked for or worked with government knows that it's bloody difficult to change civil service and political culture. It really is difficult. And this is why we take our hats off to Lee Waters, because he really has tried to disrupt things in a constructive way from within. And therefore, we've tried to identify those pockets of progressiveness in Welsh Government, in the civil service, and among politicians who can work with us to promote this new culture of co-production that Carol and Julie have been the original architects of. So that's where I would see us going forward in terms of this debate, but not getting hung up on public versus private versus civic. Thank you, Debbie.
Can I come back on that briefly, Debbie? Because it seems to me it's the message of the morning, really. You know, if you think of foundational, you can think of it in terms of what and how. And if we think about what, there's substantial agreement, as Lee said when he kicked off, we're all on the same page. The how is what we are now struggling with. And again, we can all see what we need, Debbie, which is coordination of splintered agencies, capacity, capability. The real difficulty, as Kevin has just been saying, is how do we build that capacity and capability in a whole series of different problem areas? As it happens, our lot in Manchester has recently been looking at town centres and at reforestation. And in both of those cases, the what is relatively straightforward, but the how raises all kinds of questions about coordination and capacity building, where in the next phase, we need to put our heads together and figure out a Welsh way of doing things.
I think that's a point well made, Carolyn. And Sophie, can I pull you in? Because I was interested in what Amy was saying about path dependency and thinking in the context of Kevin's point about the need for co-production and the fact that we all recognise what Lee has been saying, that Welsh Government resources is constrained. And so recognising we've got constraints and we've got the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which, you know, in effect puts into legislation the need to co-produce things. I'm interested in your perspective of where that's been easy to achieve and where the hurdles still are and what you think needs to change.
Yeah, I mean, there are mixed reviews, for example, on the public services boards. I'm slightly more optimistic than some. I think they've taken a long time to get off the ground, but what we are starting to see with some of them now is that there is that kind of collaborative working, at least with the partners that are on the PSBs, in a much greater way than there was before. And even going beyond that, what they call themselves the G7, the sort of the PSBs in the Gwent area are actually coming together in quite a sensible way. Where I think we're, you know, and there is still some, you know, definitely some kind of, you know, good examples of this. So, you know, Lee will know about, you know, Cardiff and Active Travel, where they've been really working with some of the NGOs, they've been working with the private sector through, you know, ARUP and others. They've been working with a whole range of, you know, public sector organisations, health, working with the local authority to sort of redesign what their transport plans are in the city. So there's definitely some good examples, but we're still not absolutely there. And I think for some public bodies, we are still seeing this reluctance to let other people in, and that is a real problem in terms of bringing in some, you know, disruptive thinking, because I absolutely agree that is what's needed. And I think that is just like a massive cultural change. Going a bit sort of off piste here, but you might have seen one of the things that I've been advocating recently is a creative basic income, and you know, there are a number of reasons for that. One, because the creative and, you know, freelancers and so on are you know, really up against it in terms of COVID. But actually, part of what I'm proposing there is how would you bring creatives in at an early stage to the planning, design of policy, services, infrastructure, to really start doing some of that disruption. And I think if we took that approach across anything that we do, who are the people that we need to sort of bring in? Yes, the core people who have expertise in particular fields who we need to work with, and the community organisations and the private sector and so on, but also who are the kinds of real disruptors who may not have expertise in this field, but might throw in, you know, a bit of a grenade, which could actually, you know, change our thinking in terms of the way that we do things. I think that's the place that we need to get to. But I'd come back to, I suppose, those, you know, 4 or 5 points that I made in answer to the previous question. It's about leadership and the culture, therefore, that the you know, leadership creates. It's about support and challenge. It's about having people's back and telling them that you know, you want them to innovate, you want them to take risks, and you'll have their back if it fails. Because without that, I think people are still very much sort of closed in there. It's best that we just do this ourselves because we can control it. The problem is the things that we're controlling and the ways that we do them are not working. So we need to find new ways of letting people in.
Thank you very much for that, Sophie. And I think we've just got time for a very short concluding question. So I'm sure probably people have touched on this in what they've said already, but just interested probably in 1 or 2 sentences from each panellist about what the biggest barrier you still think is, or on the more positive side, what the biggest opportunity is for taking this agenda forwards. If I go with Elin and then Lee and then Sophie.
I think the greatest barrier to moving this forward is making it something that's relatable to anyone on the street, kind of thing, any business owner. anyone working within the local government on a very local level. You know, making the foundational something that makes sense to them. That's the biggest barrier, because that's where you're going to have problems getting buy-in. And I think the greatest opportunity for the foundational economy is just, you know, I really think it's such a massive opportunity to create communities that are actually resilient, that are actually able to stand on their own 2 feet, that are actually able to create futures for our children and allow them to live within our communities and not feel like they have to leave to be successful. That's such a massive thing, and everything we need to make that happen is already here. You know, that never happens. So I think the potential to make great changes to people's actual lives is massive.
Thank you very much. Lee?
So I suppose that's the biggest barrier is it's just hard. You know, it is easier to destroy than it is to build. And this is about rebuilding. It's about, you know, in Carol's work and others, this is about a response to the fragmentation of neoliberalism and the impact that's had onto our economy and our society and our communities. And this agenda is about repairing that by you know, weaving a thread through the wound and to allow it to heal. That's just hard. So I think that's the biggest barrier. And you know, my personal concern is just momentum, the need to just get momentum for change, given it is so slow to move and so difficult. That you know, the agenda could easily get discredited if we're not able to demonstrate this is more than just an academic theory. So that's, I suppose, the biggest barrier. The biggest opportunity is necessity. You know, and that's the thing. You know, we've got looks like you know, a no-deal hard Brexit upon us in January. We've got the largest economic slump in 300 years. Because of COVID, and this is going to cause enormous damage to our communities. The agency of government is constrained because these forces are huge, particularly you know, a economically regional government like the Welsh Government. The powers we have at our disposal are limited to deal with challenges like these. But the great thing about the foundational economy is if we're able to get our act together, this is something we have the power to do. We don't need extra money. We don't need extra powers. We can get on with it. It's the £6 billion power of public purchase we need to mobilise as something practical that we can do that helps every community. So that's, I think, the greatest opportunity. Is just we've got no alternative. You know, this is one of the few things that we can do if we're able to mobilise, and that's the trick, I think.
Thank you, Lee. Sophie?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, that there are a number of the stars are aligning in some ways, and, you know, Lee alluded to the kind of, you know, the necessity we're going to have to do it. So I suppose there's a kind of, you know, the element of never waste a good crisis. But I also think, you know, public attitude is increasingly there. So, you know, that point around people do think it's madness that we're, you know, procuring our food from, you know, miles and miles away when there's a farmer next door who's kind of struggling to make ends meet. I think people are valuing the kind of, you know, their local communities, their local shops. They've seen during COVID, if they weren't seeing before, the kind of additional value that they bring. I think we are seeing leadership happen in pockets, and, you know, and I think you know, as much as Lee and I often have kind of quite robust conversations, I think Lee is a key part of that leadership. I'd like to see him, you know, do even more in terms of disrupting perhaps the rest of his cabinet colleagues. I think we've got the legislative framework there in terms of the Future Generations Act. You know, there's more to come in terms of the social partnerships bill and so on. And so it comes back to, for me, it all comes back to then the nitty gritty and doing the hard yards to get into the nitty gritty, working out what are the problems, what are the barriers that we need to address. And, you know, between us all, even on this call, you've got government ministers, you've got someone who's responsible for I suppose, for the Future Generations Act. You've got professionals, you've got procurement experts, you've got leaders of organisations, you've got academics, you've got, you know, a whole wealth of experience. And as Lee said, we don't need extra powers. It is something we can do. If we're not between us able to get into the nitty-gritty of breaking down some of the barriers to enable this stuff to happen, well, that's a poor show. But I genuinely believe that between us, if we are willing to do the hard yards on that nitty gritty, then there's some exciting things that could happen, and that we will build that kind of movement for change, and that momentum will keep going towards doing the right thing in this area.
Thank you very much, Sophie. That feels like a very nice positive note on which to wrap up the session. I'd like to thank very much all the panellists and all the participants as well for making this such a lively discussion, and also to Chloe for organising it, which I know is not easy over Zoom. Thank you very much for that. And just to note as well that, as you know, this session has been recorded, so that recording, I believe, will be available in due course as well. So thank you very much to everyone. Again, I hope you enjoyed this session.